Welcome to another edition of Teach the Geek interviews. My name is Neil Thompson. I am the founder of Teach the Geek. I work with technical professionals so they can present more effectively, especially in front of non-technical audiences. And you can learn more about that at teachthegeek.com. Again, that's teachthegeek.com. Today, my guest is Dr. Sam Jones, and she's all about science communication. In addition to being a freelance science journalist, she's the producer and co-host of the Tiny Matters podcast, a podcast that answers many of life's questions. But she wasn't always into science communication. She was once a biomedical scientist. So I'm really curious to find out why the switch to science to communication. So let's get into it. Welcome to Teach the Geek interview, Sam.
Thank you for having me.
From the bit of research I did on you, I saw that you got a degree in biology. What was the motivation to get that degree?
Yeah, so I think I was always someone who was kind of fascinated and by the life sciences. So my dad was a science teacher for many years, a middle school science teacher, and so I think starting at a young age, I sort of had this interest in the natural world, and I think he really helped sort of cultivate that. And then, yeah, I think it was just one of these things where I sort of just gravitated toward things that were biology related, whether it be, books or movies, or I was just interested. And it's interesting because when I went to college, I went to Vassar College in New York. I actually went in thinking, I want to go into something writing related. Maybe I wanted to go into journalism, and I loved science, but I never really put two and two together. Like science journalism is a thing. And so, ultimately I found myself there, but yeah, science was just always a thing that I thought was so fascinating. It's the never ending questions. I think that's really what gets me. Can always ask more questions, always
Oh,
learn new things.
100%. But you didn't just stop there. You ended up getting a PhD too. So what was the motivation to get a PhD?
Yeah. So I think, I was sort of struggling with, what I wanted my, I guess, science journey or future career journey to look like. At the end of undergrad, I actually got my teaching certification in New York State. So I taught like AP biology, marine biology, for a bit, thinking, do I just want to go into teaching? Because I love the communication of it all. But there was this little piece of me that felt like I want to see where research could go. So I ended up working as a lab technician at the Stowers Institute for Medical Research in Kansas City for about a year and a half while I applied to graduate school. That was sort of a test for me. Do I like bench work? Do I like being in the lab? And I did. I liked it enough to explore it further. And I also felt like there were a lot of potential career opportunities where having a PhD would actually be really beneficial for me, like if I wanted to teach at a university or something like that. And so I felt like I didn't go into a PhD like some people do, thinking my ultimate is becoming a PI, but I went in thinking maybe that's a possibility. Maybe I'll work in biotech. Who knows? I did not expect to make the pivot to science journalism. It did not even cross my mind until a couple of years in. But yeah, I kind of felt like getting a PhD, there were more pros than cons. So I figured, why not? Let's do it.
Okay. But okay, you said that a couple of years into your PhD is when you decided, or the idea of science journalism came to your mind. What prompted that thought to come to your mind?
Yeah. So I think I started to kind of realize that a couple years into my PhD that I really was very interested in the questions that not just I was asking, but people around me were asking. And I started to think about the possibility of really finding a niche where I wanted to do research for decades. And I could not figure out what that would really be. And I started realizing that I'm someone who's, I guess, a bit more of a generalist. I like learning about a huge range of topics. And I knew that staying in academia for me would be limiting in that way. And I think, I had a pretty okay graduate experience. I think compared to a lot of people that I've spoken with, it was not too bad. But I just didn't feel that same enthusiasm that I did when I was explaining a variety of topics to friends and family or members of the public. And so I started sort of seeking out other I started seeking out other potential avenues for careers beyond academia and beyond biotech. And so I started just attending as many career fairs as I could at UC San Diego. And I ended up going to a bunch of them, patent law, like just science policy. But then I stumbled upon one related to medical writing. So medical writing, very different from what I'm doing. It's definitely, medical writers are the people who write up phase 1, 2 clinical trials, that kind of stuff. And so that's not ultimately what I wanted to do. I realized I wanted to reach a pretty general public audience. But that was sort of where this little thought of, well, maybe writing would be a really great, a great option for me, because I've always liked writing. And so then I took a science writing course at UCSD in their extension program. And I just fell in love. I started realizing that I could not just write for magazines or, newspapers. There was podcasting, there was science video, there were people called public information officers. And so it just kind of kept going from there. And then I started writing as much as I could. I started reaching out to people at UC San Diego, trying to write press releases. I did a kind of mini internship. I guess it was a small internship, but it kind of lasted for many months. And I had this wonderful mentor, Tiffany Fox, who helped me figure out, or really was so essential for me understanding the difference between academic writing and writing to reach a more general audience, sort of the formula for making that possible. So yeah, that's a very long-winded explanation of sort of where I was a few years into my PhD. And then I just kept writing as much as I could through the rest of my PhD while balancing lab work, and ultimately moved into science communication full time.
I find it so interesting with people like you, Sam, because you do PhDs, and PhDs are very particular. You're going down a certain rabbit hole of research, and yet what you ultimately wanted to do was write so that you're not in a pigeonhole at all. You're not in a rabbit hole at all. You wanted to get to as many people as possible, and yet you're doing something which is the exact opposite of that.
Yeah.
and yet here you are. But you know what? That's oftentimes what happens in life. We start off in one place, and then we very well may end up somewhere completely different. And that's actually one of the reasons I was really happy that you were willing to be a guest on my podcast, because people like you they're not as common as you would hope. Because oftentimes I think what happens with a lot of people is they start off down a path and they figure, I have to stay down this path. I spent this much time getting this PhD, and I mean, hopefully I don't offend anyone when I say this, but you don't need a PhD to be a science communicator. I've had a number of science communicators on the podcast that don't have PhDs. So you might think, I spent however many years. I know these biology PhDs are a long time. You could be in there 8 years in some cases. Like, I spent 8 years to do something that didn't require the 8 years. I was like, no, I wouldn't really look at it that way. It's just, you changed your mind, and that happens, and that should be allowed, and you shouldn't feel like some sort of academic failure because you didn't do the postdoc after, or maybe you didn't become the tenure track professor at a university. And yeah, I mean, I've actually had another guest on here. His name is Dave Giltner, and he helps PhDs transition into industry. And one of his big messages is that even if you wanted to stay in academia, you might have a difficulty doing so because there aren't enough positions that for the people who actually want to be able to stay. Yeah. So that's how you end up with people doing postdocs for, time immemorial. One year turns to 2, turns to 3, turns to 4. It's like, how long are you supposed to be poor?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I would say also, I mean, I've had a lot of people ask me if I needed to get a PhD to go into science journalism. And the answer is, of course, no. I will say for me, though, if I hadn't started the PhD, if I hadn't gotten a few years in, I would have always wondered if research was where I really should have been. And so I think I would have never found science journalism if I hadn't gone into a PhD program, which is kind of interesting. I think also I found that the critical thinking skills that I developed during my PhD, this ability to really interrogate a set of experiments and ask a bunch of questions and, just kind of be doubtful of research has made me a much better journalist. Because I think regardless of the sort of scientific field or arena, I'm able to understand the material well enough to ask, like, was that a well thought out experiment, or what are the holes here? And I think that's really valuable. And I would not have that to this degree if I hadn't done a PhD. So I don't know. I think for me, doing the PhD was really essential for me to be able to find science journalism. And it did mean a few more years, but I also, before getting to where I wanted to be, but at the same time, I was able to sort of build a portfolio and spend a lot of time thinking about if it was really what I wanted to do for, almost 3 full years before going into it full time. So I felt like when I entered science writing, science journalism for real, I felt really prepared. I felt like I wasn't just making a blind leap, I had really thought about it and mulled it over for a very long time and sort of progressively added clips to, my resume. And so yeah, I think that for me was actually, people have different journeys. But I would say, oh, sorry, I don't know why my screen was just freezing. I would say that people have very different journeys to, their ultimate career, and mine is still shifting, I will say. but I think for me, it just made sense. And I'm ultimately glad that it happened the way that it did.
What did your PhD advisor think about your move to science communication?
Well, I would say that in academia, I think it's shifting, but I think that overall, there isn't really much understanding of careers that are beyond academia and biotech. I had an advisor ask me if I could actually get paid for writing, which was a weird question. Like, you think no New York Times writers get paid to write for the newspaper? You think it's just fun? It is fun a lot of times, but also we need to eat food. So, yeah, so I think overall there just wasn't a real understanding. And I think there's also in graduate school, which kind of drives me a little crazy, is that I think there isn't a lot of times PIs do not leave the space for exploration beyond academia. And anything that you do that is not directly related to the experiments that you have planned, to the project you're working on, to ultimately to a academic paper, is often frowned upon, because anytime you're spending on something else is time that you could be in the lab, is time that you could be working on something that ultimately benefits your professor. But, I would never, I was always putting in a lot of time in the lab. I was just going above and beyond and working like 70 hours a week, because 20 of those hours were writing so that I could build up my portfolio, which was really exhausting and hard. But I think I don't know. I think it was, overall, my experience was quite disappointing in that sense. But I knew it was something that I really wanted to do. And it brought me a lot more joy than being in the lab. So it's weird to, some people would think, oh my gosh, you spent the whole day in the lab and then you spent 5 hours at night writing. That sounds terrible. I'm like, actually, writing was a break for me. It was fun. It was something different. It was a break from my reality in the lab. So yeah, I would say I didn't have anyone actively working against me, but I did not have anyone ever at any point say, oh, that's really great that you found that. Or like, do you need any, not help? I don't, or just like, yeah, it was disappointing. I did have actually one person who was a former dean of the graduate school, put me in contact, I think, with a former biomedical sciences student who has become a science writer, which was very nice. But everything else I just did, I did a lot of cold emailing. I did a lot of cold pitching. I reached out to a lot of organizations, and my success rate was quite low, but you don't need to succeed every time. You just need a couple, and that will help you move forward.
100%. Sam, you mentioned earlier that your graduate experience was a positive one, but now it's sounding like there was a little bit of negative there. But you also said that other people had more difficulties. So I'm thinking, man, if they had more difficulties, how difficult was it possibly?
Yeah, I mean, so it's all relative, right? Like,
right.
I think there are a lot of problems in academia, like a lot of problems. And so I will say that I published, I got out in 5 years. I made a lot of great friends. I really enjoyed my fellow graduate students and postdocs in the lab. And yeah, so I will say in that sense, it was quite positive. It was positive in a sense that I was able to find what I ultimately wanted to do. But I think the academic environment a lot of times is very toxic. And so, yeah, it's all relative, because I've talked, and some people have really great experiences. They have like really, really great experiences. And so I don't want to discount that. And I think there are a lot of amazing mentors out there. But I think as a graduate student, I heard more horror stories than not. And that also did not make me want to stay in academia. And I think every field is different, like every field is different. And plenty of people could argue with me that their experience was great, but yeah, I would say the system needs some serious restructuring. They need an HR department. Academia needs HR.
Wow, now the truth really comes out. Well,
yeah,
thank you.
yeah.
Maybe I'm the reporter now. I'm the one doing the digging. But hey, what could possibly go wrong? You have a professor who is motivated to put out papers and bring in research money. That's how they're judged and how they get their tenure. Well, how are they ever going to be able to get all that work done? It's through the grad students and the postdocs. And so what could possibly go wrong? It's like what are your needs, postdoc? What are your needs, grad student? I don't care what your needs are. You need to put out these papers. So I can get my tenure.
Yeah. I think it is this weird thing where graduate school, you're supposed to be viewed as, it's a training experience. You're a student, but it's like, depending on the situation, you are viewed as a student or you're not, right? Like, are you trying to figure out what you want to do? Ultimately, it doesn't matter sometimes. It's all that matters is that you get the data that's needed to publish a paper, to get more funding. So it's hard. I don't know. But I will say, like, I had some amazing PIs who I interacted with, wonderful people who I worked with, which is why I say overall my experience was positive. Like, it was not easy, but at the end of the day, I can look back on it with more positives than negatives, I guess. But it was not like a cakewalk. That's for sure.
I mentioned in the intro that you are a producer and co-host of the Tiny Matters podcast. Could you tell us a little bit more about what the podcast is about and what you hope people take away from it?
Yeah, for sure. So the Tiny Matters podcast, it's a science podcast. It's about tiny things in our world that have a big impact. So maybe that tiny thing is a microbe. Maybe it's a transistor in a computer. We have an episode coming out in a couple of days that's about detection dogs. So it's about, the different chemical compounds that dogs are able to detect that would tell them there's an explosive here, or an invasive python, which I thought was so interesting. I didn't realize that detection dogs can be trained to sniff out pythons, or some sort of disease. Like, there are dogs that are being trained to detect different types of cancer or COVID. So the podcast really covers a huge range of topics, which for me was really important because that's what I love to do. I love to deep dive on things that are science, but like a huge range of topics and fields. But I also wanted to be able to reach a general audience. And so our audience, all of the content is geared toward, people who have a high school, maybe early college education in science generally. But any sort of jargon, or, if we talk to an expert and they throw a lot of dense material out there, my co-host Deboki and I, it's our job to be able to really break that down and present it in a way that's digestible and interesting to a general audience. So yeah, it's been really fun. We are just over a year in. It launched, I guess our trailer launched in December 2021, but our first full-length episode launched at the end of January 2022. So we're just over a year in, and it's been really fun, really great so far. So yeah, it's been a good time.
I'm glad that you and your co-host are willing to kind of get into help the person that is the guest with the jargon. So you can break down what exactly this person means. Is there ever an instance where you actually just ask the guest, you use this term, what does that mean? Or do you actually know what these terms mean and you just go in and explain them?
It depends on the episode. It depends on the episode, but a lot of times I will start out by asking a guest, okay, for someone who has never heard of X, Y, and Z, can you explain this very basic principle? Or, and I do prep the guest saying, this is the audience we're striving to reach. Let's start big picture and then get into the nitty gritty. So just kind of little things to allow an audience to get comfortable with the concepts before slamming them with information. I think that, so I'm pretty straightforward with our guests when it comes to that. But yeah, Deboki and I will oftentimes, we step away from the interview. We figure out what clips we're going to use, what things we're going to summarize, what information really needs to be laid out a little bit more clearly for the audience to understand the concepts.
Yeah, that's really important. And just because if you're coming from a certain level of expertise, you're obviously not going to have the same level of expertise as the person who's the guest. And if they're not adept at putting it in such a way that people can really take in, then they're just going to think, I have no clue what this person's talking about. And I'm not really sure that this is the podcast for me. But luckily, as I said, they have you and your co-host. They're able to kind of put things in a way that other people can understand. Is there ever an instance where you prep the person, you say, look, this is for people with high school educations or early college, and yet they still don't, or they're still not able to describe things in a way that people can understand? And if so, what do you do in those situations?
Yeah, I mean, so yes, that definitely happens. I think, I will often preface the interview with, I'm going to ask you questions. I might ask you a few questions that to you seem like pretty much the same question. And it's just because it's good to get additional takes to maybe, hear a slightly like a slight variation on your response. And so I've sort of already prepared them for me to be asking for clarification throughout. I will stop someone and say, oh, you mentioned this term. Do you mind explaining that a little bit for any audience, any listeners who have never heard that word before? And, if it's still jargony, if it's still going to be hard for someone to understand, that's when I just say, okay, let's just keep going with the interview, make a mental note. That's something that Deboki and I are going to have to explain. And it is a narrative. Yeah, it's a narrative driven podcast. So it is much easier. I can insert myself as opposed to this, which is conversational. Tiny Matters is a combo of narration and conversation. And so it's very easy to have an expert say a thing, and then the next part is Deboki or I saying, okay, so what this looks like in practice is, so.
That's hilarious. Because now I'm thinking, if I'm the guest and I'm listening back to that episode, I'm thinking to myself, they asked me the clarifying question. I answered the clarifying question. Yet now I get this narration where they're explaining it even more. Like, what I didn't explain it well enough. What's their problem?
Well, maybe that's a good moment of reflection for them for future podcasts. Maybe we save them for future podcasts.
Oh, that's hilarious. Sam, when I first started this whole endeavor of this podcast, this YouTube channel, it stemmed from my own failings, my own struggles. giving presentations in front of people. So I may very well have been like one of your guests or many of your guests that had issues with explaining things in a way that non-technical people could understand. And I had to do this on a monthly basis. And I didn't get the memo that I sucked at all of this until my project got canceled. And that was really the wake up call that I needed to say to myself, this may be something I need to get better at. So when it comes to just presenting in front of others, is that something you've always been good at? And if not, what did you do to get better at it?
I would say, so I'm naturally extroverted. And so I think that already helps quite a bit because I'm pretty comfortable talking in front of people in a social environment. And so I think that's helpful. But absolutely, I've had many moments where I get a little bit like deer in headlights when I start talking. And I think, for me, what I found the most helpful thing is to practice saying whatever you're going to say out loud. Hear yourself. Don't just read through what you're going to present. Say it out loud. Maybe say it out loud in front of a couple people, or just say it out loud in your house, in a room by yourself, because hearing yourself say the words means they won't sound kind of foreign coming out of your own mouth when you're actually giving a presentation. There's this kind of weird out-of-body experience thing that I think happens a lot of times when you're giving a talk or, public speaking. I don't know if you feel that way as well, but there are these moments where you're like, is that my voice? Am I saying words? And so I think just practicing that and hearing yourself say those words. I also think right before I give a presentation, not right before, but maybe an hour before, I will just out loud say the first minute. Because what I've found is that it's really the first minute that drives most of my anxiety if I'm speaking publicly. And once I get through that, it's like, it just happens. It's like I black out and I'm just going, it's just that first minute is where I kind of catch myself. But beyond that, yeah, I think once that first minute's over, I'm like, whew, okay, I'm settled in, let's do this. And then it just kind of happens more naturally. So yeah, that's what I found works best for me.
When I first started giving, actually, I shouldn't even say first. It's because it still happens. I get nervous before I give presentations, and I honestly see it as normal because I think if you don't get nervous before something, it's probably because you don't care about the outcome of it. But when it comes to presentations, do you ever get nervous? And if so, how do you deal with your nerves?
Yeah, I absolutely. I think it's always, a few minutes before I'll have that moment where you get like a little bit of that butterfly feeling in your stomach, or, your throat gets kind of dry, or, you just notice when you're swallowing, it's this like exaggerated swallowing because you're just, your body's revving up, you're getting ready. For me, I think it's just reminding myself that I did practice. And like I said, if 30 minutes before I'm giving a talk, if I've run through that first minute and a half and I feel like this is good, I can remind myself of that to kind of get myself to calm down a little bit. I think for me, that's been the most useful thing that I learned to do. I actually learned to do that during graduate school. So in a way, graduate school kind of prepared me to be able to interview people all the time because I'm constantly interviewing people. And it's, being recorded. So, yeah, I think that's kind of my biggest tip is hear yourself say the words many, many, many times leading up to when you give a talk. And then maybe an hour before, just run through the beginning, like know how you're going to introduce yourself. Just like simple things where like, hi, do you want to say that? Do you want to say, hi, I'm so glad to be here. Do you want to say, I hope everyone's doing well? Like just things that seem really silly to practice, just say it out loud because then it just makes everything smoother. And so then, there aren't these like hiccups of, was that awkward? Did I sound weird? Like, what did I just say? How did I just address people? So I think that's kind of the biggest thing.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And now I think about it, that's probably something that I should focus on a little more because oftentimes before you give a presentation, if someone's introducing you, they'll introduce you. by your name. And then oftentimes one of the first things I say is, "Hi, my name is," and I'm thinking to myself, "Why am I saying my name again? They already said my name. This is the time the time I'm wasted. I could have said something different, something that they didn't know already." But this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for taking time to speak with me today, Sam. How can people get in touch with you?
Yeah. So you can find me on social media platforms at Sam J Science. And then my website is sjoneswriting.com, that just has a lot of my, print writing as well as audio and video. So yeah, find me there and happy to connect. Also happy to connect on LinkedIn. So reach out.
Excellent. Everyone, that marks the end of another edition of Teach the Geek interviews. My name is Neil Thompson. I'm the founder of Teach the Geek. And if you want to learn more about that, you can go to teachthegeek.com. Again, that's teachthegeek.com. Until next time, take care and stay safe. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you, Neil.